Hey guys, welcome back to Fight for Your Right Fishing. I'm your host John Dietz, and today we're going to be breaking down my steelhead and salmon setups as far as fly fishing, center pin, and spin fishing. So we're going to break all that down between my heavy, my light setups, line, reels, rods, the whole deal. So stay with me and let's get after it. Right here. Right here. Right here. Oh God! Find him! This is Fight for Your Right Fishing. Alright guys, so the first thing that we're going to break down is we're going to go through some of the baits first off, because I feel like that's kind of the meat and the potatoes of what you're using, whether you're using a fly rod, a spinning rod, a center pin, what have you. The baits are all going to be staying kind of the same. So the first thing that I'll go over is my bead setup. So this is my bead box. You can see I've got all different assortments, and with so many different colored beads on the market today, it's kind of overwhelming with everything that is out there. You know, there's all kinds of translucent, solid, middle colors. They have all kinds of different swirls and whatnot in them. And I'm going to break it down for you right now. You don't have to have all those. You don't have to have half of those, a quarter of those, an eighth of those. Find a few colors that you like, get them in a solid, a larger color, like a 10 mil, maybe a 12 mil, and then just get a couple, vary in the size, get all the way down to 8s, and get 2 or 3 of those, have them in a solid and a translucent color, and that'll set you up. You can see I have my pinks, my chartreuses, my oranges, and then a couple, I have some blues and some whites. That's it. And you can just see, I'll show you some of my favorite ones. I really like a 10 chartreuse and orange. I don't know how well you can see those. That chartreuse, that's a really good color, as well as this really solid orange. And then I back those up with, as well as like a 10 mil pink. It's just a solid standard pink. Because I'm a firm believer that if they're going to eat a chartreuse one, they're also going to eat, a solid orange one or whatnot. I know color plays a good role, and if you mix it up, you're obviously going to have better success and different success. And there's colors that look similar, and there's colors that don't look similar, but I feel like a feeding fish is a feeding fish. And if you present, a decent presentation, they're going to eat it. So I think color plays a role, but not as big a role as some people make it. And then I got my light pinks, I got my translucent oranges, and then I got a translucent chartreuse. That's also a really good color, and an 8 mil. Just downsizing that a little bit. And then I have my solid ones and a little bit smaller too. And that's all you need. I have some bigger orange ones, but you don't need all these fancy colors. Like I said, fish are opportunistic feeders. They're not gonna not eat it because it's not the perfect shade. Sometimes they can be picky when they're super pressured, and color will play more of an important role. But a lot on these bigger fisheries, it's really not that important. You gotta just have a right presentation, and that's the most important thing that you can have. So those are my bead setups. Now we'll go into some of my fly setups. I fish a lot of jigs. A lot of jigs. But as you can see, I stick with whites and emerald colors. That's pretty much it, because that replicates everything that's going to be in that stream or the forage that those fish are going to be feeding on. And I'm also a big believer just like with the bead colors, it's not that important. You have a couple basic colors that you like that are easy to tie, and those fish are going to eat that jig. It's all about getting that moving presentation in their face. Now with some species like coho, they prefer certain colors that are similar to what they spawn in, like a pinks and purples. But other than that, I stick with my whites and a transparent color, and that'll do me. But I like to have them in varied weights. I like to have them from a 32nd all the way up to an 1/8 ounce. Like you can see some of those jig heads are pretty big if you're getting into some deeper water. And I know that looks pretty flashy, but it does a really good job at, you know, triggering some of those non-feeding fish, or some of those fish that have been beat to death by egg patterns drifting over them all day. So, you know, and I also have like some ones that I run on my center pin, which is just, you know, a zonker pattern with some sparkle dubbing underneath of it. Looks like a smelt, an emerald shiner, pretty much everything that they're going to eat as far as a minnow. So those are my jigs. I can do a video where I'll break down how to tie them later, but for now, you know, just have a couple colors that you like that imitate what you're fishing around as far as the forage, and, you know, maybe a couple really solid ones in case the watercolor gets dingy, maybe some black ones. I don't really fish black a whole lot, but I know it does good. Just personal preference, I don't really like to throw a whole lot. So that breaks down that. And then a wild card is I like to throw some pink worms once in a while. What I'll do is I'll slide my bead up and just hook that pink worm on there. And I don't fish it all the time, but what I do is if I get to a spot where I see there's a lot of fish in a hole, what I'll do is, you know, I'll fish it with my typical beads, my jigs, and then after, you know, I've exhausted that, what I'll do is just put one of these on, and usually I can get one aggressive fish, one or two, depending on the conditions. So that's kind of the typical baits that I'm going to run. You know, my beads, my flies, my jigs. That's kind of that setup. So the next thing we're going to go into is the fly fishing setup. So for steelhead, I like to run a 10.5 foot 4-weight, a Cortland nymphing rod. It's their standard nymphing rod. They just came out with it a couple years ago. And I like that 10.5 foot because it gives me a little bit more reach while still having the flexibility to run lighter line, 4 or 6 pound test. I don't really go down to 2 that much. I don't think it's necessary. You know, steelhead are, you know, they're clever, but they're not super smart, and it's not like they're real finicky like a stock or like a little wild trout where they can hit it and let it out real quick. Well, if they hit it, generally they got it pretty good. So that's why I feel like I can just add a little bit more weight and not lose the feel too much. But that's the typical setup that I use for my rod. If I was going to be salmon fishing, I would run a 10.5 foot 7 to 9 weight, somewhere in that range, depending on the salmon that you're fishing for and, you know, where you're fishing for them. You can get away with a lighter rod if you're fishing in a stream that has more restrictions in it, like if you're fishing Oak Orchard or some of the like Johnson Creek or something like that, one of those smaller creeks where those fish don't have the room to run. Whereas if you're fishing somewhere like the Niagara River, you're going to want a 10 weight. You're going to want a 10 or 11 weight because those fish are going to whoop you because they can use that current to their advantage. But the typical breakdown that I use for my reel, this is just an Akuma. I can't remember them. You can see it's worn out because of how old it is. I'll link it in the video description just because I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head. But I'll break down kind of my leader setup for it. And most people run fly line as far as like floating fly line, their stereotypical 9 foot 5 weight, and that's a perfectly good rod. And you honestly get away with any rod on the Erie Tribs. It's not really going to hurt you. It's not going to help you to use a 9 foot rod, but I like that longer rod to get more reach out of it. What is going to extremely help you is I run a nymphing line. You know, I don't run a typical floating line, like a weight forward floating line. I run a nymphing line because what that does is oftentimes the only reason a floating line is used is because you're fishing dry flies. It allows you to carry that weight of those flies. But with steelhead fishing, you know, you're throwing egg patterns, you're throwing streamers, you're throwing jigs, you're throwing little stone flies, that kind of thing. So you want to be able to fish further away from you in those heavy currents and whatnot. And if you're using an indicator, it makes it even better because you can use that indicator as a float. Just, you know, get your presentation out there further. But this nymphing line is going to allow you to keep your line off the water and keep you more in contact. That floating line is heavier and it weighs you down. So what it does is it creates drag on the water and it makes your flies not present right. Because you have to think those fish have one job, and that's sit there in that current. You know, whether they're going upstream to spawn or whether they're feeding or they're stationary, they watch food, debris, everything float by them all day. So the more natural you can get your presentation, the better. So I'll use this Cortland nymphing line, and then what I do is I taper it to, or I add a 20-pound leader to it. You know, it's 20-pound Maxima Chameleon. I like it because it's fluorocarbon, it has low stretch, it sinks, and what you can do is it just tapers everything down, and it's just a heavier diameter. So you want to taper it from the diameter of your fly line to what your tippet is going to be. So that's why I start with that 20-pound. Then I'll add, you know, it's probably like 6 feet of 20-pound. Then I'll add 3 feet of 15-pound, and then I'll go to my cider material. It's starting to get knotted up over here. Unknot this real quick. So what this is tapers to 15-pound red amnesia, and then that tapers to 12-pound yellow Suffolks. And I like those two because they're relatively stiff lines. You know, typically when you're running a colored line, it's monofilament, it's really flimsy, but I want a stiffer line to roll those flies over better to allow me to cast them further. If you're using an indicator, obviously it doesn't matter because you're going to be like chucking it, but if you're contact nymphing, that's where it all comes into play. And then I just taper that to my tippet. I typically run like 4 to 6 pound on it, depending on where I'm fishing. And if I'm steelhead fishing, I'll run 2 flies, and I'll just use a surgeon's knot to connect those 2 flies to have a tag end off there. And I'll run, you know, it's typically 2 egg flies, maybe an egg and a minnow pattern. But if I'm salmon fishing, I found that their skin, honestly, in most places you're not allowed to fish 2 flies. But if you are, I found that their skin is so abrasive that even if they don't eat it, it catches them and you foul hook a ton of fish. And that's where a lot of people give fly fishermen a bad name, that they foul hook all these fish because, you know, honestly, they're setting on the feel of it, not the sight of the float going down as much. So those flies will get caught on fish because they're smaller, sharper hooks. So it just happens. You know, it's nothing to be ashamed of, but it's just something to be cognizant of when you're fishing, and try to diminish that as much as you can. If I was going to be fishing for salmon, I would not use this reel, but I would use, this is a 4-weight reel, I would just bump it up to an 8-weight reel and have a lot of backing on it to be able to, you know, withstand those fish making long runs. Put that back. Maybe. The next thing we're going to break down is we'll go to float fishing. You know, plain and simple. I have 2 float fishing setups. I have a light and a heavy. So I have 2 rods that I like. I have this Lamiglas Redline. This is a 10.5-foot rod. This is my Erie kind of rod, you know, my Elk Creek 20 mile. This is going to be my smaller stream rod. I can run 6 pound very comfortably on this rod, 4 pound even, and not break fish off on the hook set. It's got very good action on it. And I pair that with a Shimano Sedona or any of the Shimano line. They have really good spinning reels, but it's just a smooth drag reel. And I have 15-pound Suffolks 832 braid on there, and I run it in that bright green color just because it helps you see that line. And then I just taper that. I put 20-pound or just any kind of monofilament on there. What that does is that gives it a little bit more cushion too on that hook set when those fish are doing heavy head shakes and stuff at close range. Just provides that little bit extra cushion. And then after that, I add a barrel swivel. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, right there. So I had a barrel swivel right here. That barrel swivel will then have 6 pound coming off of it. And I do a different setup than most people do when they float fish. A lot of people run all kinds of split shot from their float down. I don't really like that aspect of it because if you run split shot right below your float, you're only feeling right below your float. I like to keep my split shot just a couple inches above where my bait is, so that way I know I'm in contact with it. If your float does anything goofy, then you know you're not seeing what's actually going on. But you can see how I have my bead set up on here. I'll unhook this so you can see how I typically run these. This is what I'm talking about, my split shot just a couple above it. And these are just like, I don't even know what size split shot they are. I'll link them down below as usual. They're just smaller split shots, you know, comfortable size that you like. And then what I do is I just have my first bead on there, and then I run a size 8. What is this, Owner SSW? Yeah, Owner SSW cutting hook. And the biggest thing you have to know about running these hooks if you're running them with beads is they have to have this upturned eye. I don't know how well you can see that. But so the hook comes around and it has an upturned eye instead of it being down toward the hook or straight toward the point of the hook. Because what that does is that when a fish eats that bead, this is going to come across, and you don't want anything to inhibit that hook point from hitting the direct fish. You know, if you have a pointed eye or a downturned eye, that's going to like add another point where it's going to want to deflect off of that instead of just the hook point coming in and hooking them in the side of the face. So that's just something to be aware of. And then I just tie, you know, improved clinch knot right to the bend of that hook, and then I have another bead right below that. And you can see I'm running a hard colored bead and then a light colored bead. That just gives you 2 different opportunities to catch fish. You know, I like to run a really solid one where if the fish are really active, that's the first thing they're going to eat. Whereas if they're not as active and they're kind of skittish, they'll eat that softer color bead. But that's my breakdown for my smaller stream spinning rod. And if I'm running that one with smaller split shots, I like to run either a 6 gram or a 3 gram blood run float. And I like these two smaller floats, and I like them in this specific version because you can use stretch tubing on the top and the bottom, as you saw sitting on that rod, to hold your float in place. And if you want to go from a 3 gram to a 6 gram, all you have to do is pop the stretch tubing off the top and the bottom and pop it onto the 6 gram. So it makes it really easy to interchange floats when you're fishing. You know, if you get to a little bit deeper run and you add some weight, you know, you can have to add a bigger float. And I also like these because they have a darker color on the bottom, but not a pitch black. But I believe that when fish are looking up, it's just like if you look up during the day, you don't see direct colors, especially if you're looking up at the surface of the water. What you see is just shades of it, you know, since you're seeing the bottom of it, and those fish see leaves and everything float down during the day. So that darker shade, I think, is just more natural than something really bright. So that's my small stream rod. Now if I'm fishing for lake trout or bigger salmon in a bigger river, I like to use this Lamiglas X11, and this is in a 12-foot rod. Yeah, this is a 12-foot slow medium, and I like this upper grip on it. It's like the Michigan style grip, just because I can use that as my forearm pressure. And you can do that with the other rod too, but I just like cork. And you can see I have, we call this the AP rig. I don't know who invented it, but my buddy Jake Schneider showed me it. We're using a 3/4 ounce arrow float on there, and you can tell we were running some deep water for the Niagara River. And so I run the same setups as far as the reel, the line. I still go with that 20-pound mono, and that's frayed. I need to change that out. But that 20-pound mono just adds more cushion in there, you know. And then I taper that to another barrel swivel. And but when I do that, then I'm gonna have a bobber stop because this is a slip float. And then I'll have a smaller bead followed by one of these little corkies, then my arrow float, and then your least favorite color bead just as a stopper to prevent you beating up this knot. And then I run a trolling weight. So what that trolling weight does is that just helps push everything down. And then after that, I run more 20-pound off the bottom of that with, you know, an egg sinker, maybe 2. Like I got a 1/4 and an 1/8 on there because the water I was fishing was a little bit deep. Then another bead. This is still that 20-pound. Then I run that down to another barrel swivel. And off that barrel swivel, that's where I'll run my 12-pound, my 10-pound, my 8-pound, what have you, to my beads. And those egg weights, those egg sinkers, those really just help to get you down to the meat of where you want to fish. Those will get you down right to the bottom. So I still run similar bead combinations, similar bead colors, but it's just on a beefed up rod. That way you can put some real leverage on those fish and get some real power behind them. And it's all about how you fight them. And I'll do another breakdown on a video with that later. But for now, I just want to go over the gear. So that's my Niagara River setup specifically. Maybe salmon too. That would be a really good salmon combination. But now we'll get into what I've been doing lately. And I started center pin fishing. So let's get that rod out here. And this is my Kingpin Kinetic. I just purchased this a few weeks ago. It's been a new toy for me lately. The casting's been a little iffy, but we got it figured out. It's nothing you can't learn after practice. But I run that on a Shimano Claris. This is a 13-foot medium light, and I like that 13-foot just for the longer reach, the castability of it, and then it just cushions your tippet, you know, your main line, or I mean your tippet a little bit more. So I can run 6-pound test on this rod still perfectly comfortably, but with that length, it transitions into backbone later down the rod, so I can still put the nuts to fish when I hook a bigger fish in heavy current like on the Niagara River. I have yet to test it out on a lake trout, but I think it'll do all right. I don't think I'll get totally stripped. But then what I run on that is I run 15-pound blue blood run, and I like that blue because even when that water's low and clear, blue's still a relatively natural color, so it's not going to startle those fish as much. And honestly, when you think of people running a center pin, a lot of people like to put a lot of weight, a lot of split shot, because that helps with your castability, your drifts. You know, it helps pull that line off that reel a lot more freely, so you don't have to help it or do anything with it. But what I found is I like to run it like just how I would run another float setup. I just like to put a couple split shots down near where my bait is, because it just helps me keep my mindset right with what my bait is doing. You know, that's what you want to be asking yourself the whole time you're fishing, is what is my bait doing? So that way you know what it's doing, you know if it's fishing right, if it's not fishing right. I run the same size floats. You know, I got a 3 gram on here right now. I was fishing I was fishing a jig with it over in Conneaut Creek. So I still fish the same setups, but if I get into deeper water, I will beef the float up, I will beef the weight up, but I still like the same weight pattern. You know, I've watched a lot of videos where guys like to let the weight or the bait get to the fish first, so they hold back on their float so it swings their bait to the fish. I don't believe that. Those fish see all kinds of stuff going down through there. They say the shot would scare the fish, maybe if you have a whole chain of it, but those couple little BBs on there that I put on there, you know, I just run Gremlin split shots, you know, the stuff you've used ever since you were a kid. What size are these? These are 3/0. I like the 3/0 if I'm fishing a little bit heavier current, and then if it's not, I'm using single beat. Because honestly, you don't have to have a whole lot of weight for a lot of the creeks we fish. These guys use those big bead chains, and honestly, I think they're doing more harm when that hits the water. You know, that startles the fish a lot more than anything else. But those fish see all kinds of stuff float down through that creek day in and day out. They see rocks, sticks, pieces of debris. You know, a couple split shots isn't going to scare them. What's going to scare them is your drift. You know, if you're swinging those flies in front of their face all day, or they're swinging those egg sacs or beads or jigs or whatever, you know, a jig looks natural swinging in front of their face, but eggs don't swing in the current. So it's just all about how you present it is what it comes down to. So that's what I like to throw with it. And I'll do another video on the casts too. I'll break that down so that way you guys can see kind of how I'm casting it. But so far, I really like this Shimano Claris. I've caught a lot of steelhead on it, and it handles them really, really well. You can put a lot of leverage on those fish with that 13-foot model. I think they make an 11 or a 10.5-foot model too. That would be good too if you're fishing smaller streams, but I still like the 13-foot. But those are the basic rods and reels that I fish, as well as the baits. We'll do some on the water videos later to kind of give you some more ideas of how we're fishing it and where we fish certain techniques versus you know, not fishing certain techniques. But hopefully that helps you guys as far as the gear. And like I said before, I'll link everything below in the video description. But if you guys have any questions or comments, throw them down. I'll answer them as soon as I can, as soon as I see that they're there. And until then, stay fishy. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Peace out, everybody.